Hello.
Hi.
I'm just waiting for Kat to come in and then she can take over.
Hi everybody, welcome to the panel, Sexuality, Defiance, Hope. I'm just going to hang on for a few more minutes while some more people trickle in and then we'll get started. All right, hello again. I'll start the ball rolling as we've got everybody here now. Thank you for coming and welcome to our Sexuality, Defiance, Hope panel. It's our last panel of the conference, and well done if you've been attending a lot of the previous panels as well, because I bet the Zoom fatigue might be starting to set in by now. But I'm really, really excited about this panel. It's building off themes that are largely related to LGBTQ history. We have some fantastic papers. They're exploring themes generally related to queer resistance, alternative gender identities, and we're also taking a turn towards more contemporaneous understandings of queer and gender identities across the world. And I think that the international scope of this panel adds a really exciting dimension to our guidance. But first of all, I'll just start with a little spiel about any Q&A information and technical difficulties. So if you would like to ask a question, feel free to do so at any time. You can submit any questions through the Q&A function. And these will be answered at the end of the session once everybody's given their presentations. And if you're experiencing any technical issues, firstly, I would say panic, because minor hitches happen to all of us all the time, and sometimes they resolve themselves. If you're experiencing any substantial issues, you think I am or any of the other panelists are, you can let us know through the chat function, or if that isn't possible, you can send us an email to marginsdecenter@gmail.com, and one of the team will be on hand to help you. Also, if you're tweeting about the conference, you can use the hashtag UGHistConf, so that members of the team can find your tweets and share them. I believe most of that information has been posted in the chat, so if you have any queries about how any of that's spelt, that should all be there for you. But I will get started and introduce our panel chair, Dr. Rebecca Jennings, who teaches on the history of gender and sexuality in modern Britain. Rebecca completed her PhD at the University of Manchester, and she taught there for a few years. And then she took up a research fellowship at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Her research mainly focuses on 20th century British and Australian lesbian history, and she's the author of some major publications, including Tomboys and Bachelor Girls, A Lesbian History of Post-War Britain, A Lesbian History of Britain, Love and Sex Between Women Since 1500, both published in 2007, and Unnamed Desires, A Sydney Lesbian History, published in 2015. She's currently completing a monograph arising from research with the Australian Research Council into lesbian practices of intimacy in Britain and Australia, 1945 to 2010, excuse me, which traces lesbian model relationships and parenting practices in post-war Britain and Australia. And I will hand over to Rebecca to introduce our panelists.
Thanks very much, Kat, and thanks so much for inviting me. This is my first year of having the pleasure of being involved in the Margins to the Centre conference, and it's been fantastic. So thank you. Such a great initiative. I also just wanted to start by apologising for the fact that my inadequacies with Zoom mean that I wasn't able to add my pronouns to my name, but my pronouns are she and her. Okay, so I'm really excited about this afternoon's panel. We are going to, if it's okay with our speakers, take them in the order in which they are on the programme. So I will introduce them all now, and then we will hear our three speakers speak, and then take questions at the end. As Kat mentioned, if you have any questions that occur to you as we go along, then please do add them to the Q&A, and then we'll take them when all the speakers are finished. So I'm really delighted to introduce Carter Sawopski, who is currently studying a BA in English with a minor in gender studies at Trinity Western University in British Columbia. Carter has been active in the Mars Hill newspaper, both as a contributor and currently as the editor of the Arts and Culture section, which sounds fascinating. They have both a President's Scholarship and frequent mentions in the Dean's List during the last few years. So so we're really looking forward to hearing from Carter in a moment. And then our second speaker will be Finn Merrim, who is studying a BA in French and History at the University of Kent in Canterbury. Finn has a number of academic interests, including the Sultanate of Women and the Ottoman Empire, Europe under the Nazi regime, LGBT plus history, Sephardi diasporic history, and early modern Russia. And some of those interests will be coming together in Finn's paper today, thinking about LGBT plus identities under the Nazi occupation of France during the Second World War. And lastly, we'll be hearing from Rosine Smith, who is a history student at the University of Portsmouth, who is interested both in history and international relations. And again, Rosine's talk today will be exploring both of those issues, thinking about the kind of historical impact on contemporary LGBTQ plus activism in Ukraine. So I'm really excited to hear all three of these papers, but I'm going to hand over now to Carter, who's going to kick off the panel for us. Thanks, Carter.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. All right. So I'm Carter, and I'm so thankful for the great introduction. Really happy to be here with you all. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that I'm a guest from ancestral unceded territory of the Solo Nation. I speak from the biased perspective of a white person, a settler in Canada. Through this project, I wanted to center the history of Two-Spirit Indigenous folks in North America and their experience before, during, and after settler colonization. I aim to trace the history of Indigenous colonization and the intergenerational trauma that it has inflicted upon Two-Spirits. I researched how they're doubly marginalized by both their local Indigenous communities and Western queer groups. And through this, I seek to amplify Two-Spirits' experiences as centers of wisdom and resilience. So, Two-Spirit expression and understanding before colonization. Prior to European arrival, many Indigenous nations held in high regard those whose gender identities did not fall within the gender binary and those who were not heterosexual. Two-Spirits encompass those with gender variance, unique dress, specialized work roles, same-sex attractions, and special spiritual identities. They were celebrated from a young age as gifted from the Creator. Because of their unique abilities to understand both male and female perspectives, they were typically afforded special status. Two-Spirits were often the visionaries, the healers, the medicine people. For many Indigenous nations, the medicine wheel, as pictured here in the bottom, represents a worldview in which life is interconnected. This circle represents the continuous interaction of all elements, the cycle of knowledge, as well as the 4 stages of life. The term Two-Spirit itself upholds this interrelatedness of all aspects of identity, including gender, sexuality, community, culture, and spirituality. Marcy Angeles on here talks about this identity as a blessing, a gift to see through both eyes. And while this term for self-identification, Two-Spirit, was only coined in 1990, there have always been people whose identity has aligned in and around this term. Two-Spirits have always predated the LGBTQ+ framework of today for gender and sexuality. In my research, I found it was important not to use the term anachronistically, but to use the terms that these Indigenous folks use for themselves. It is very nation-specific, and Two-Spirit is a pan-Indigenous term. For instance, in the DNA language, there are at least 6 genders: Adsin, which loosely corresponds to woman; Hastin, male; Nali, feminine man; Dilba, masculine woman; Nadli, Adsa, lesbian; Nadli Hasti, gay man. This is all very loosely tied to what we know today. And all of this comes from their own creation stories. Each nation has their own creation stories often. So as we move into contact with Europeans, Non-Indigenous anthropologists often use the term berdache, which meant capped boy, in a very broad manner towards Indigenous individuals who fulfilled mixed gender roles in their tribes. Often in their writings, these settlers applied this term to any male who they perceived to be homosexual, bisexual, or effeminate by Western social standards, leading to a wide variety of diverse individuals being categorized under this imprecise term, and at times they incorrectly implied that these individuals were intersex or hermaphrodites. The term berdache has always been repugnant to Indigenous people, hence the move to two-spirit language. These people pictured here, Kauksuma Nupika was a Kootenai warrior and served as a cultural intermediary, but as she was documented by European settlers as a man-like woman, and Azah Wendib on the bottom right was a warrior also, but depicted by settlers as a man who makes himself as woman and are called women by the Indians. So post-contact and methods of colonization. Each Indigenous society had its own distinct ways and language to acknowledge those who existed beyond the European binary impositions of gender, sexuality, Christian religious moralities. And yet these traditions were routinely silenced, repressed, and avoided for the safety of relatives during these processes of colonization. Two-spirits were often advised to go underground out of love and respect from their communities. Under Spanish rule, for instance, many two-spirits were thrown into pits of starved dogs, as pictured here in this painting, and eaten alive. Missionaries also played a large role in this attempted eradication of their ways. They forced the Eurocentric gender dichotomy onto Indigenous folks, which played a huge loss for their culture. They cut their hair and forced them to style in ways that matched this binary and their assigned sex at birth. Churches and government agents were often the main instigators of this violence, and chiefs were reluctant to defend their own. The impact of residential schools cannot be understated, as two-spirits were specifically targeted and punished according to acting outside of their assigned gender at birth, regardless of their non-binary identities or their family community roles before. So Christian teachers and administrators at residential schools sexually abused and assaulted Indigenous children. And I found in my own research that there was little evidence or little research done about two-spirits in these residential schools. But it's a known fact that many survivors soon began to equate homosexuality and non-binary gender with the abuse they endured, which led to traumas and attitudes being brought back to their communities, and hence this intergenerational trauma. Because of the gaps in cultural tradition that were lost in this colonial translation, some Indigenous societies today question if it was the European colonizers who brought gender and sexuality variance in the first place to the First Nations. And this misinformation, this misleading, led to the high rates of isolation, dishonoring, suicide, and violence against two-spirits, which continues today. So double marginalization. The atrocities of colonialism continue to manifest today in many two-spirits double marginalization. People who are both Indigenous and queer often experience homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, as well as racism in their everyday lives. This experience of multiple intersecting forms of oppression is known as intersectionality, as many of you will know, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. This violence against two-spirit people by settlers did not remain in the past. Fred Martinez, pictured above here, was brutally murdered in a hate crime at the age of 16 in 2001. He had a fluid gender presentation and identity, and he identified himself as gay and Nadli in the Navajo tradition. He was known by his Navajo community as a boy who was also a girl. We might classify him as two-spirit, but he did not specifically identify with that term. And Jamie Lee Wounded Arrow on the bottom here, a trans Lakota woman from South Dakota, was the second transgender person found murdered in 2017. Two-spirits murders were not counted or recognized by the Trans Day of Remembrance or the list of murdered trans people until 2017, and she became one of the first to be recognized outside of Indigenous communities. So two-spirit youth are incredibly vulnerable individuals who often lack community that might support their identities. In addition to their alienation, the intersectional effect of racialization and their gender intensifies these consequences of colonization on women and two-spirits especially. Because of their intersectional position between Indigenous communities and Western queer groups, they are typically otherized from both groups, and they lack support and experience pushback. They're often left to educate themselves, do their own healing work, as there's few others that will be willing to help them. They experience stigma within their own Indigenous communities because of this loss in colonial translation. They usually are forced to migrate to urban centers from their reserves or small communities. In the cities, though, they experience further racism, exclusion, and rejection by non-Indigenous settlers. Additionally, they are plagued with guilt and shame often for not feeling Indigenous enough. There continues to be health disparities because of racism and social exclusion for two-spirits. We also see that Indigenous people are less likely to access mental health resources in times of need because of this fear of discrimination and the history of institutionalization. So decolonization, healing, reclaiming. Two-spirit folks have always been healing, resisting, and reclaiming their identities from colonization. But it takes a village, and it involves breaking silence within Indigenous communities and initiating intentional unlearning, especially for the Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders. Recovering this traditional fluidity and inclusivity means is a difficult and isolated process, as we can see. But it should not be an alienating burden for them alone to traverse. It's imperative that we disrupt this program of white supremacy and prioritize decolonization by paying close attention to their histories. This must include the acknowledgement and understanding of the history of colonization and its impact. For non-Indigenous folks to be involved in this process, this is a critical step. In addressing indigeneity, mainstream queer communities should work to amplify two-spirit voices along with the oppressive colonial histories that continue to engender marginalization and erasure of two-spirit peoples. Successful decolonization demands bold creativity, re-education, and return to nation-based knowledge systems and ways of being. The very aspects of Indigenous cultures that were and are targeted by colonial persecution throughout history will subsequently serve as sources of resistance and resiliency for two-spirits. For many communities, art is often a vital element in reclaiming one's queerness and one's unique indigeneity. It becomes a fruitful way to share their two-spirit identity through poetry, drag, writing, photography, all ways of resisting. So I have a question for you. How will you decolonize your queer activism and allyship? Thank you.
Thank you, Carter, for that really powerful talk. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions and comments on that at the end. Okay, we're turning now to Finn Merum. Can I just, Kat, am I right? In I don't have the program in front of me, and I'm worried that I'm putting everyone in the wrong order. Or is Finn the next?
No, don't worry, you're all right. You're correct. That's the right order.
So Finn, over to you.
Thank you. So yes, my name is Finn Moram, and I will be presenting Are You One of Them? Queer Men in Occupied France. So firstly, to give some of the context about the occupation itself, it began on the 25th of June 1940 following the signing of the Italo-French armistice. Mainland France was divided into two separate zones. In the north was the zone occupée, which literally means the occupied zone, which was under a direct German military administration. And in the south was the zone libre, the free zone, which was under the control of Maréchal Philippe Pétain and his fascist government, which is often referred to as the Vichy government. So secondly, to contextualize homosexuality, prior to the revolution of 1789, homosexual acts were punishable by death in France. This was normally carried out through burning, and the last burning took place in Paris just a few years before the revolution began. In 1791, the penal code was rewritten, and there was no mention made of homosexual acts. And then this was maintained in the 1810 penal code, which effectively decriminalized homosexual acts simply by omission. Jumping forward to the 1920s, Paris had a vibrant queer subculture, and through this became one of the gay capitals of Europe alongside Berlin and London. However, within the country itself, coastal cities such as Saint-Malo, Toulon, and Marseille had much more stronger connotations with queer subculture. Paragraph 175 of the Strafgesetzbuch had made homosexual acts illegal in the German Empire, and this was carried on into the Weimar Republic and then into the Third Reich, and would be carried into East and West Germany until the 1960s. The Nazi government made numerous amendments to paragraph 175, and under this, approximately 100,000 queer men were arrested. Of these, 15,000 were sent to concentration camps throughout the war. Possibly the biggest issue in the research for this is that there is so little scholarship available. France did not recognize members of the LGBT community as victims of the Nazi regime until the early 21st century, which made the possibility of discussing queer members of the resistance virtually impossible. The vast majority of sources that are available are not contemporary. They're predominantly post-war memoirs and interviews that took place almost 60 years after the end of the occupation. There are a few academic articles available, notably those by Julian Jackson and Michael Sabalis, but French newspapers have been a much more reliable source in this respect. And this is usually to do with books that have been published, movies that have come out, and especially in the last 15 years, the deaths of people who had been in the resistance. It's also important to note that there's very little available in English, and the vast majority of sources are, of course, in French. So in this paper, I discussed two people directly, the first of which is Daniel Courtier. After the declaration of war in 1939, he went to North Africa to fight. Specifically, he was in Algeria, which was a colony of France at the time. However, after a couple of months, he went to London instead and joined the Free French Army. After this point, he was a devoted member of the resistance and became the secretary to one of the heroes of the resistance, Jean Moulin. In 2009, he published his memoirs, which were titled Alias Caracalla, and he came out as gay in this book. One of the questions in this paper is whether sexuality served as a rallying point for those who took a side in the occupation. And in the case of Courtier, I don't believe this was the case. He joined the resistance out of politics and a belief in the liberty of France from fascism. His sexuality may have been part of it, but he never spoke about that. So then we have possibly his polar opposite, Abel Bonnard. He was a collaborationist, a writer, and eventually a politician. Between 1942 and 44, so right up to the end of the occupation of France, he was Minister of National Education in Pétain's government, so in the Vichy regime itself. He was a fascist by conviction and had been involved in fascism from about the 1920s. When the occupation began, he was noted for his warm reception of the occupying forces. And perhaps the strangest part of Bonnard's story is that he was openly gay. It was a well-known fact, and it was often satirized in contemporary media. And going back to this question, it seems contradictory to say that his sexuality was a rallying point, and so I can't agree with that statement. It was yet again a political belief that drove him to collaborate and to actively participate in the occupation. So another question that arises in all of this is this notion of an épuration culturelle. So for context, épuration means purification, or in the case of the occupation, generally means purge. So there were two purges after the end of the occupation, the first being the épuration légale, which was the criminal prosecution of those who had collaborated. And then there was the épuration sauvage, which was vigilante justice taken against collaborators. Shortly after the end of the occupation, we see this image of the homo collabo arise. So homo collabo is the short form of homosexuel collaborationniste, which literally means homosexual collaborationist. And this was this notion that queer men collaborated solely by being queer. And as a result of this, the notion of a queer résistant, a queer member of the resistance, became incompatible with popular thought. And this feeds into this idea of the épuration culturelle. One of the longest lasting images of the épuration sauvage, so the vigilante justice, was that of the femme tendue. These were women who had had relationships with Germans during the occupation. Some were women who had simply fallen in love, others were prostitutes just doing their job, and there was every other kind of woman in between. They would often be dragged from their homes or off the street, and their heads would be shaved. They would be painted with swastikas, and there are reports of tarring and feathering in some parts of France. However, we don't see anything similar in the case of men who had done the same thing. So those who had participated in what's called in French, la collaboration horizontale, or horizontal collaboration. I assume you can work out what that means. However, perhaps there is a case of the entendu, and that is in the idea of an épuration culturelle, which was a cultural purge, one where people had to believe in the idea of the homo collabo in order to be at peace with what had happened. Perhaps the most notable example of this is La Mort dans l'âme. This is the third book in Les Chemins de la Liberté by the globally acclaimed writer Jean-Paul Sartre. The book depicts the occupation through the eyes of various people who were living in various parts of France at the time. And one of these characters is a collaborationist, and this is Daniel. He is very, very pro-Nazi. He is very proud of collaboration, and he is gay. It is a crucial part of his character. And there is a long passage at roughly the beginning of the book in which Daniel waxes poetic about the sheer beauty of the occupying forces and how the Germans were improving France aesthetically from the outset. And this plays into this strange concept that we see in the post-war period, and that is the fetishization of Nazism and of fascism in general. This was brought up by Susan Sontag, who compared it almost to wanting to describe fascism in some bizarre warping of BDSM and of this idea of erotic domination being brought about through political occupation. And so finally, to conclude, sexuality did not serve as a rallying point during the occupation. It may have been a factor, but it wasn't the cause. Politics was. Historians today will have an uphill battle with illuminating this period because there is so little available because of that almost code of silence. And finally, as a result of the homo collabo, the possibility of discussing queer members of the resistance became completely incompatible for decades. And it's only just now that it seems that we can speak about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Finn, for a really thought-provoking paper. And our final speaker is Rosine Smith. So I'm going to hand over to Rosine now.
So this study will be focusing on the events of the Euromaidan and immediately after, up to late 2015. The subject of Ukrainian Euromaidan protests and the position of the LGBTI communities within the demonstration is difficult to effectively describe, necessitating use of colourful metaphors, such as Jesse Sanchez's atomization of the intense ideological conflict down to the absence of the red, orange, and green and purple of the rainbow flag from the sea of blue and yellow of Ukrainian national flags held by protesters. The study will explore the historical context of Ukraine's unique identity as a nation torn between Western liberalism and Russian traditionalism, public acceptance of homosexuality in Ukraine, the activist efforts of LGBTI organizations within the Euromaidan, And finally, the political and legislative process made by the LGBTI organizations in the years immediately following the protests, unearthing the instrumentality of the LGBTI community to the Euromaidan and the opportunities for cultivating political influence that accompany promotion of Western European moral standards. Edward Sampson's relational definition of identity through negative space, created by oppositional others, is exemplified in Ukraine's unique geopolitical condition, the intersectional culture camp formed by ideological conflicts between Western liberalism and Russian traditionalism permeated Ukrainian society, but in no area more so perhaps than the issue of homosexuality and its acceptance by the Ukrainian public. Ukraine's petition for support from the EU in the event of further Russian military incursions came with legislative stipulations that included the adoption of certain degrees of civility towards members of sexual minority groups. Ukraine's institutionalized perpetuations of traditionalist familiar structures and orthodox intolerance have long made the existence of LGBTI community a contentious and politically impotent one. Nicholas Beaumard and Dan Spermer described, so it comes as little described that most historiography discusses the political and security motivations for accepting the EU's terms. However, it can be argued that LGBTI demonstrations during the Euromaidan were also significant in affecting such dramatic shifts in the Ukrainian geopolitical and ideological space. The LGBTI community's systemic marginalization in Ukraine resulted from ubiquitous illiberalism among its populations. Levels of Ukrainian public acceptance of homosexuality wallowed at 15% in 2011, comparable to intolerances experienced by LGBTI in Russia at this time. The frank manifestations of this intolerance forced its acknowledgement, and as Balga, Skylard, and Sands argue, the development of mitigating strategies of support and resilience within marginalized groups. Pierre Nora proposes that a sense of belonging to some group becomes a source of identity, which in turn becomes of total commitment. The development of this belonging was instantiated by groups such as Nashmir and Insight, which provided legislative and accommodative support respectively, and Kiev Pride, who organized opportunities for shared experience within LGBTI Ukraine. Between these organizations and others, a comprehensive package of support was internally constructed for the LGBTI community, displaying dedication to creating a discursive space for LGBTI individuals that was demonstrative of Nora's belonging. These efforts illustrate the importance of identity to marginalized communities and the collective ability to effect change, bolstered by fervent activism and unimpeded channels of digital communication. Following President Yanukovych's reticence to agree to EU terms and the subsequent instigation of public protest in late 2013, LGBTI and allied organizations released joint statements emphasizing the importance of freedom, stating that today we are not fighting for specific rights for LGBT people. We stand under the banners of our country and the European Union as citizens of Ukraine. These statements were largely in reaction to pro-Russian false flag marches intended to undermine the relationship between LGBTI organizations and the EU, which only the swift response of these organizations circumvented. Olena Shevchenko expounded that the LGBTI community was proactive throughout Euromaidan, championing universal rights rather than specific civil rights by eschewing LGBTI symbols for nationalist flags. These covert forms of protest, Tamara Marcinyuk argues, was necessitated by pro-Russian notions of a gay roper and a heteronormative rhetoric in which Euromaidan, a space of real men heroes where there was no place for the weak, was rooted. Gay Alliance Ukraine states that the purpose of LGBTI activism during the protests was to align their pursuits of rights with Western concepts of rational humanism, emphasizing dignity and the inherent value of difference as the wellspring of human rights, and therefore a socio-political priority. Immediately following the Euromaidan, LGBTI community experienced minimal change in their experience of Ukrainian society, and legislative institutions refused to hear issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. Kiev's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, banned the 2014 Equality March, citing poor timing for such a divisive event considering the military crisis in the East. These forgotten revolutionaries would find themselves redacted from New Ukraine's foundational myth, overwhelmed by images of the heavenly hundred who gave their lives during the protests. Marina Shevtsova argues, however, that 2015 to 16 saw a coming out of new pragmatic evolutions in political strategy since the Euromaidan. Following Donatella Della Porta and Manuela Caiani's process of Europeanization from below, LGBTI organizations emulated and promoted EU standards and values, facilitating intersectional influence, including the open support and participation of multiple parliamentary members. These events, as Philip M. Ayub argues, demonstrated the efficacy of synergistic political structures associated with EU collaboration in enabling new spaces for public influence on political and legislative processes. Ukraine's LGBTI community was confronted with contradictory circumstances in the Euromaidan. Despite being ostensibly an opportunity to lobby for positive change, the protesters' radicalization and eruption of armed conflict robbed the LGBTI community of political self-representation. Matsenyuk argues that their involvement in Euromaidan was a veiled form of participation. In the absence of Nora's belonging to the protests at large, individuals reinforced their affinity for LGBTI organizations as a component of Euromaidan. Gay Alliance Ukraine's perception of the objective of LGBTI activism was a recognition of intrinsic universal human value and the correlation between this value and the dignities underpinning European human rights. This pragmatic adoption of these standards afforded significant political development for LGBTI communities, including formal EU association and the ratification of Ukraine's first LGBTI-friendly legislation. The key to social change of this magnitude for marginalized groups, EU prescribed, was a politics of visibility, the reclamation of identity, seen here in the revitalization of the rainbow flag and the overt promotion of their civil agenda, normalized by infusions of moral and ideological standards from national and international political levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosine. That was fascinating. Okay, so I'd just like to take a few minutes just to pull together some of my thoughts on the three papers, and then I'll open it up for wider discussion. So just while I'm speaking, if anybody has any questions that they would like to pose to the speakers, please do start thinking about entering them in the Q&A function. Okay, so firstly, Carter. Firstly, I really appreciated your careful tracing of the two-spirit expression and roles from the pre-colonial period to the present, and the impact of racism and the imposition of colonial heteropatriarchal structures on Indigenous culture. I was particularly fascinated by your discussion of intergenerational trauma, partly because this is an issue which I've also been grappling with in my own research, and I'd be really interested to hear a little more of your thoughts on how we can use that concept specifically in relation to histories of gender and sexuality. So that was the first question that I wondered if I could ask you to talk a little bit more about. I also, thinking about this issue which you raise of the reverberations of these histories in the present, it struck me while you were talking that this is really central to the point that Melissa Ono-George was making in the keynote earlier, and also relates to a lot of conversations that I've been having through over the last month in various LGBT History Month events around this issue of how do we negotiate both the political implications and the emotional fallout of the kinds of research that we do in the present. And again, I'd be really interested to hear any further comments that you had on that. So we'll come back to you in a moment to hear your responses, if that's okay. So Finn, again, thank you for a fascinating paper on resistance, collaboration and homosexuality in occupied France. I was particularly interested by this issue of the persistence of stereotypes about the linking of homosexuality with collaboration in the post-war period, and the ways in which this emerges in kind of different cultural forms through literature and so on as well. The example that you gave of Bonnard's history of collaboration, I think, points to the diversity of reasons for collaboration or resistance or political position taking in this period. What struck me in hearing your research was firstly the need for historians to be really open to thinking about the kind of diversity of experiences and attitudes on the part of homosexual subjects in the past, rather than making an assumption that given the kind of legal attitude of the Nazi regime towards homosexuals, that inevitably queer subjects in the past might want to resist. So I'm interested firstly in how do you explain the post-war kind of cultural investment in the linking of homosexuality and collaboration, specifically in the context of kind of French cultural attitudes towards homosexuality in the mid-20th century. But then more broadly, I was also thinking that you traced in really interesting ways the ways in which that kind of cultural investment has prevented the telling of a particular type of history around the involvement of homosexuals in the resistance. But I also wondered whether you could reflect on whether you think that some of the frameworks for thinking about LGBTQ plus history and specifically the kind of emphasis on resistance to oppression might also have prevented us from thinking about alternative histories of homosexuality in occupied France, such as, for example, Bonnard's experience. So yeah, it'd be great to hear more of your thoughts on those issues. And finally, Rozine's paper really productively situated Ukrainian queer identities between the traditionalist foundations of Russian culture and the liberalizing campaigns of Western Europe, and that was fascinating. Thank you. It was a really detailed account of the development of queer activism in the Ukraine in recent decades, and I'd be interested to hear more of your thoughts on. You talked a lot about the impact of human rights language and the politics of visibility on the development of Ukrainian activism. I wondered if you could elaborate more on the extent to which traditionalist Russian cultural ideas about same-sex desire have also shaped those forms of activism. So thank you all very much. I'll perhaps, I don't know if anybody particularly wants to go first, or otherwise we can go in the order that you were. Yeah, okay, Carter looks happy to go, so I'll hand over to you.
I can start. In response to your comments about intergenerational trauma, which I found very interesting, and it very much ties into this issue that's going on in Canada with missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two Spirits. The problem of lack of justice for those that are murdered and abducted and abused and raped. So there's definitely these effects of trauma that are perpetuated by this lack of justice. And so, in addition to the lack of attention that's being paid to Two-Spirit histories and injustices, there's the individual effects, which I think I would love to explore further. There's definitely a need for this trauma-informed framework, I think, when addressing these issues. And you can only go so far as a non-Indigenous person, but it helps to acknowledge as much as you can of these colonial histories. Yeah, so I found that a really interesting topic, especially as I was talking about Fred Martinez, who had a documentary, 2009 documentary, which kind of goes through the family's recount of the murder, the aftermath, how it affected their community, and the grief that continues on, the loss of a bright queer Indigenous person. So there's definitely reverberations, political implications of all this too, because the exclusion from trans days of remembrance, and the term Two-Spirit itself is very political, and it doesn't resonate with every Indigenous person. It's very it's a term of self-identification. So it's not for non-Indigenous people. It's only for those who are Indigenous, and it's a different move, because it pre-colonially it was your gender was given and ascribed, and a role in the community, so it was very fixed in with that, and now it's more of a political a lot of political implications, to self-identify as Two-Spirit, and to write poetry and do drag, and write as Two-Spirit. So there's a lot to unpack there. Like,
thank you, Carter. Thanks very much. And Finn.
Firstly, thank you for your comments. It was wonderful to hear. I think going to what you said about the post-war period and the long-lasting ideas around this suddenly found intrinsic link between fascism and homosexuality. It is something that you see sort of really from the start of the tensions between fascism and communism, so right back to the early 1920s, in which homosexuality was the bourgeois vice to the communists, but it was a communist vice to the fascists. And then sort of following the end of the war in France, Charles de Gaulle takes charge of the country and brings with him a very, very staunchly anti-leftist political idea, and that partially idealized traditional family values and sort of put on a pedestal the traditional view of what a French family was, and that of course had to exclude anything that wasn't heterosexual. And so really the idea of the homo collabo, and then obviously the drowning out of queer résistants, was a byproduct of an intensifying feeling towards conservatism that grew across France right up until about May 68.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you, Finn. And Rosine.
Well, this is something with Russian politics that we see in the Euromaidan. I talked about the false flag operations where Russian groups of people who are pretending to be under the flags of the rainbow flag during the Euromaidan were found out to have been employed by the Kremlin in order to create hostility during the Maidan. And this is a culture where there is repeatedly arguments that if Ukraine joins the EU, then that would at the same time instantly make same-sex marriages or instantly legalized. And this is a country where such a significant number of the population are part of the Orthodox religion. And a lot of the time in my research, it came up that there was just a lasting legacy of masculinity from the Soviet period, and that this just hasn't gone away in politics. And just even today in my research for Russian political communication, it's very prevalent that there are ideas of misogyny in politics, that any kind of femininity is seen as a weakness, and this has traveled over a lot over to Ukraine.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, we also have a few questions in the Q&A. So we have a question for for all of you, from Callum Tennant, who says, I learned about groups I'd never heard of in all 3 presentations. I'm gay, so like to think that I'm relatively aware of historic struggles, clearly not. How do you think we raise further awareness of the historical and present plights of LGBT+ groups, even within our own community? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Carter's nodding, so I'm going to hand over to Carter to have a...
Sure, I can speak for that a little bit. I know that there's kind of the temptation to, or at least for me, to think that a word might solve it, or addition to the acronym of LGBT to include 2S, two-spirit, would solve inclusion and visibility concerns. And there's kind of this conversation that's opening up recently about, does that really solve anything, or does that conflate Indigenous identity with, white settler colonization? So I think the answer is a lot more complex than, just adding onto an acronym, which I think can be helpful in some circumstances, but definitely be careful to note that, these sexual, gender, spiritual identities were long predating what we know now about gender and sexuality. So it's definitely a delicate matter, and I think it involves, centering these voices and letting them speak for themselves, and not thinking they're voiceless. They are actively resisting and reclaiming their identities. So.
Thank you. Rosine or Finn, would you like to add anything?
I would say in terms of the raising awareness, one of the most useful things we have now is the fact that we are also interconnected through the internet, through media, films, TV, things like that. And I think the more that we see queer stories being told through these mediums, the more that we'll be able to educate ourselves, so that we've got a better idea of where we're heading to and how best to get there.
Absolutely. Rosine, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, that's also something that was very prevalent in Ukraine, that a lot of these stories were told through social media and they were being filmed as they were happening. So it was very much in the public's eye. A lot of the time with intersectionality, it's found that they're sort of examined underneath the the original intention of looking at some other kind of activism or some kind of other political plight. For instance, I came across this issue during my dissertation research, where I was examining the Ukraine crisis and how it had been narrated by Russian politicians. And so I just think it's more important to just look at them in their own light and for their own specificity as a micro history in themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not my place to answer this question, but I will also just add that I think coming back to these issues that we've been exploring around the kind of political and emotional implications of these kinds of histories, that I think it's so important in addressing these kinds of the sorts of intergenerational traumas that Carter was talking about, and the kind of silencing of histories that Finn was talking about, and the kind of difficulties of finding a sort of narrative mode of expression that Rosine was talking about. I think all of these issues can't be addressed until we find a way of talking about our history and being able to recognize what has happened, that we can't deal with issues in the present until we have a kind of widespread understanding of what has gone on in the past, because these reverberations are still so present in current societies. So our second question, which is another great one for all of you, is all the examples you gave are different, but do you think there are any similarities that run through all case studies? Anybody have any thoughts?
I think it is possible definitely to see similarities. Obviously, speaking from sort of the perspective of the case studies I used, I think you see something very similar with what happened in Ukraine, with the immediate politicization of sexuality as a means of engaging in political discourse. And of course, I mean, the Euromaidan was more than discourse, but in a similar vein. And then with the issues around Two Spirits, I think the silencing that you see in post-war France and, you know, the hundreds of years since Western colonization of the Americas, there are always these connecting points between all different queer histories. And it's interesting to see that there is that one thing that is bizarrely uniting.
Yeah, definitely. Any other thoughts that you'd like to add, Carter or Razee? That's fine, if not. No. Okay, well, I think we are pretty much out of time with our session in any case. So so I think now is probably the time to thank you all for 3 really thought-provoking papers, which I really enjoyed hearing about. Such fantastic research that you've all been conducting, and as we've just said, it's just so important to be researching these areas of history. So I really appreciate hearing about them today. I'm going to hand back to Kat now for the final section.
No, thank you so much, guys. They were all absolutely fantastic presentations. I really enjoyed it, and I think we had some really interesting discussions and Q&A sessions afterwards. And I would really like to thank you as well, Rebecca, for chairing the session and coming along. You've been a great chair and given everybody lots of room to discuss their thoughts, and I think everybody has pitched in, and I think it's been really fantastic. Just to wind up now as well, we're coming to the end of the conference today, but if any of you have a little bit of stamina to carry on for another 20 minutes, we do have a concluding remarks session at the end of the conference. I believe that Rohan's just posted the link to that in the chat, so if you would like to come along to that, especially if you've missed any of the presentations throughout the day, I think that should be a really nice wrap up of everything that's been spoken about today, and you know, how we can carry on thinking about all of these histories well into our future, and how this can inform our future research. But I would just like to thank everybody so much for coming along and for your really thoughtful discussions.
Thank you.